Okay, so we're going to practice note taking mid-level, and this is going to do two things. One, it's going to help you gauge your ability to focus on something that is mid-level as far as interest, maybe even low level as far as interest, and see how well you can manipulate your attention. And then the second thing that it's going to do is it's going to help you practice note-taking skills in whatever particular style that you're going to do. So I gave you some options in the previous video of ways that you can take notes, and you can research those on your own. It's Cornell notes, box notes, mind mapping. There's all sorts of different ways that you can do it. But I particularly like this method because this is what engaged me. Okay. So here is what we're going to be working with. And I want you to imagine that this is me as a student walking into a classroom and only seeing on the board that we are going to be working with the idea of Albert Camus on exile. All right. That's all of the information that I have. Maybe this is a brand new unit of study. I haven't even opened the textbook on this yet. All I know is I'm walking into the classroom and this is what the teacher is going to be talking about today. So hopefully when you walk into the classroom, there is some hint as to what is going to be talked about today in lecture. Maybe there's a PowerPoint, maybe there's a textbook, maybe there's something on the board. Hopefully that is there for you, right? So, okay, so I'm going to go Albert Camus, and then is there any other information on here? It has to do with philosophy. By the way, I really love this podcast, so I strongly recommend that you check this out. Okay, no, not much. All right, so here is my paper. This is my notebook, right? So I'm going to put up here Albert Camus, and then the anchor image for me when it says in exile, I think of someone who has had to like leave their home because they've been kicked out. So I'm going to put exile as the big idea in the middle there. All right, so now we're going to practice this skill together.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen West. This is Philosophize This. So, listen to these last 3 episodes we've done recently on Albert Camus. You can hear some of the terms he's been throwing around, like solidarity, rebellion, lucidity. You can hear these things and be on board with what he's saying in theory. But it's quite another thing to be able to apply these things to your life in any sort of real way. I mean, you can theoretically understand. You could be looking at the world in a more life-affirming way. But look, you can't just all of a sudden be like, oh, I get it now. I just gotta be more lucid about stuff. That's what's been missing from my life this whole time. No, to Camus, you don't just think your way into a more lucid framing of your reality. This is something that in many ways a person has to arrive at through lived experience. That much like in the work of Dostoevsky, or the religious mystics we've talked about, or even certain lines of Zen Buddhism on the podcast lately, there's certain insights about what it is to be a human being that can only be arrived at by experiencing them directly. And to Camus, one of these important experiences that you gotta have in your life, but that a lot of people spend most of their lives running away from, is what he's going to call the experience of exile. Now, just to understand what he's talking about here, let's start with an example of exile that's far too extreme, and then we'll readjust from there. Imagine being a member of a village deep in the jungle somewhere, lots of people in this village of yours, and let's say one day you do something that makes everyone in this village really mad at you. They all decide they've had enough of your genius behavior for one lifetime, and they cast you out into the jungle and say to never come back. Now, when you're out there in the jungle all by yourself, eating leaves, rubbing sticks together, jaguars circling in the background, well, this is not a good feeling, this feeling of exile from the safety of the community you once lived in. You could say this is a type of homelessness you're experiencing here. That being in exile is a matter of being smacked across the face with the fact that this village you used to be a part of, in terms of it providing security for your life, turns out it's not as solid of an option as you once thought it was. I mean, there was a time when your place in that village felt like it was the absolute truth to you. But now you're starting to realize there's some real limitations to it that make the security that once felt like home start to seem like it was a set of illusions. For Camus, exile is going to be this state of metaphysical homelessness. It's going to be when we lose a sense of home, usually against our will, where then once we're in this new place without a home, we may long to go back to the way things once were, but exile is going to be where, for any number of reasons, we find that it's impossible to go back to the same set of illusions we once lived in. And as you're no doubt guessing by this point, for Camus, this is going to apply to far more areas of our experience than just being physically exiled out in the jungle or something. Because we aren't just physical creatures to Camus, obviously. An important thing about the environment that we live in is that it also includes this existential tension of the absurd. And at the level of the universe, you are not entitled to a permanent state of anything in this life. Yeah, when it comes to physical safety, but how about also to knowledge about the world, to love, meaning, beauty, belonging, whatever it is? I mean, any form of these things that you ever experience in your life, Camus, is strictly provisional. These are subject to change. These are things that need to be revised on an almost everyday basis by you. And to not do that work, to spend your life making arrangements where you see these things as more owed to you or unchanging than they really are, well, this is to do what most of us do, and to spend your life on the run from this feeling of exile. And when we encounter these sorts of limitations and are hit with the fact that our old set of illusions are shattered, and that no matter what it is, that there really is no promised land for us in this life, the realization of that fact, the living immersed in that fact, that feeling of exile for Camus is going to be one of the most important things you can ever experience if you wanted to affirm life at a level that few people ever see. It's something that points the way towards a reintegration with people and the world itself, away from theoretical abstractions. And here's the thing about exile, like I said before, this will be something for him that you ultimately have to experience. It's not something you can get to by just thinking about your thinking. We'll talk about several different examples today of very important ways exile shows up in our lives. We'll also talk about some common methods people use to run away from it all the time. And Camus was a master, by the way, of spotting exile, even in the little things that people just explain away. Things people swear to you are just normal ways to behave. Should be said, though, Camus, doing his best to be an artist in his work and not a philosopher. He's already shown us some pretty beautiful images of exile so far in the work we've already covered. He shows us Sisyphus, clearly in a state of exile as he's alone, pushing his rock up a hill, condemned by the gods. This state of exile that he's in, leading to the lucid realizations about his life that Camus asks us to imagine. There's also Meursault in The Stranger, who's in a state of exile, where he's a stranger within the very society he lives in. Then there's also his book, The Plague, we talked about, where Camus shows us a more collective state of exile, where Dr. Rieux, Jean Theroux, and others encounter the plague, and then they're quarantined into a state of exile where their city's cut off from the rest of the world. He eventually shows us how it's only through being in this state of exile together that they eventually face the absurd head on and find solidarity.
Okay, so this is a good place for us to kind of stop and talk about the tension that you might be feeling. So if you were taking notes with me, fantastic. Take a look at my notes, and you can compare them to yours if you want to, but remember that's not really the point. You will see that there were three examples of Camus giving us imagery that talks about the main idea of the lived experience of exile and why it's important. The only one that I got down was Sisyphus. And the reason that I got that one down is that that one is the one that I'm most familiar with. I know The Stranger, and I know the other one that I literally don't remember right now. There's a short-term memory, right? But remember, when I'm being asked to perform this information, whether it's on a test or via an essay, if I need to pull something as specific as the other two examples of imagery that this particular lecturer is hitting on, then chances are I can find that information in my other resources, right? This lecture is not going to stand in a vacuum on its own. And if I need to, I can also go and say, I missed the other two. And I can stop and raise my hand and say, I'm so sorry I missed the other two. Could you give me those again? And ask for that. But if that's too shaming and you don't want to do that, you can ask after class. You can ask your friends. You can look up online. All of these different resources. Right now, we are sitting in the tension of taking notes for this lecture. And the fact that I hooked onto this one is important because it contextualizes it for me. I'm going to be able to look back at this and I'm going to be able to go, Camus has given us these different images before. And the one that I best remember is Sisyphus because I can relate to that particular story, right? And so I remember that particular story, and that's me contextualizing, right? All of this other stuff, we're going through and I'm just listing words and then I'm trying to group those words together. And if you were watching me, you could see that at certain times I started kind of doodling, right? So like I'm waiting for him to finish talking about, the different aspects of being outside the jungle village and like what that means and how that can be emotionally detrimental for you. And I kind of like captured that concept here. And so there's no need for me to continue engaging in that by drawing. And so instead, what do? I need to keep my brain engaged, but also kind of at that mid-level of attention because I don't want to get hyper focused on trying to doodle every single thing, right? That's not the goal. And I don't want to drift off in my attention and be like, la, 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 and draw everything else. So instead, what do? I focus back on my notes and then I started drawing this little thought bubble, right? So it can't be through lived experience. And when I was drawing that particular thing, it was when he was talking about how like you can't just think about the experience of being out, outside the village in the jungle. You have to actually live it. So I'm drawing this little thought bubble, and it's really not contributing anything to my notes, but it is allowing my brain to engage in that mid-level attention, right? Which again is a skill. So we're going to keep going. And I'm going to show you how long we've been listening to this particular lecture. So we have been listening to this particular lecture for 5 minutes. So if you found yourself starting to drift off, this is mid-level attention at 5 minutes.
Exile, again, then, becomes the uncomfortable thing that gets them to this deeper understanding of their true connection to others. And look, if all you had were these really well-known versions of exile from the work of Camus, well, you'd be fine, honestly. Your life would probably still be pretty good, all things considered. But as the resident guy in your life here that spent way too much time reading philosophy in my life, I want to turn you on to another book that Camus wrote later in his career, where it's the most focused effort he ever gives us in his work of creating images of this concept of exile that are highly relatable. It's a book he wrote in 1957 called Exile and the Kingdom. 6 short stories, all of which paint a different image of people caught in a state of exile. And it's usually, by the way, a complicated double form of exile for these characters, as we'll see throughout the book. And these examples are great, I think, because, well, look, bubonic plagues, mythical figures pushing a rock up a hill, these are all wonderful and all. But there's something about having real examples from the lives of people that'll allow us to unpack exile in this episode a lot more effectively than we otherwise would. So consider the first of these 6 short stories. It's a story about a woman named Janine who finds herself pressured to go on a vacation with her husband. It's the story Camus chose to open the book with, and he gives it the title, The Adulterous Woman. Now you hear that title, and you may think this is a woman that's going to be having an affair with someone in this story. Well, not in the way you may be thinking. Should be said, this whole vacation that Janine got pressured to go on isn't just a vacation. Her husband's a salesman in the book. He travels to the Sahara Desert in the country of Algeria to sell stuff to people. And he doesn't want to be going on this trip all alone, so he asks his wife Janine to go along with him. Let's go together and just call this whole thing a vacation, he says. She admits when she imagined going on this trip up in her head, she thought it was going to be a bunch of soft sand and palm trees everywhere. Paradise, basically. But then she actually gets there, and she is soon hit with the reality of being in the desert. The heat, the cold, sand everywhere in your shoes and your hair, rocks and dead grass essentially as far as the eye can see is what she has to work with. But more than just with the landscape, though, Janine is shocked when she gets there by the very different, nomadic sort of people that live in this desert region of Algeria. She doesn't like them that much. She finds the way they act to be abrasive to the way she's used to seeing people behave where she comes from in her home country of France. Now, some important context here about this story and about the rest of the book. Camus himself is a man who was born in Algeria and then moved to France later on to further pursue his artistic career. And because of this, he's a man who feels a special connection, outside of writing this book, to both Algeria as a country and France as a country. He loves both of them. Now, Algeria, during this time that he's writing this, was a colony of France, struggling for independence. They're in the middle of a war fighting with France. And as is the case with many colonial situations like this, I mean, even if you're not someone that's actively shooting a gun, there's horrible violence going on around you, power struggles. I mean, to call this a tension that exists between the people of Algeria and their French colonizers would be an understatement. But remember, though, Janine in this book is a woman from France who's on vacation in Algeria who's looking at the people that live there, annoyed by many of their differences to her. She thinks they're weird at times, arrogant and inconsiderate at other times. I mean, you can imagine this married couple from France in the middle of the desert on vacation. You know, some guy that lives there may walk by them a little too close for their liking, and her husband's like, oh, who do these people think they are? Janine's like, oh, honey, just let it go. Let's get out of here, away from them. In other words, these are a couple of very closed-off people that judge everything around them, constantly trying to keep their world as small as possible. And this is Camus' point here. On this particular trip, Janine is going to start to notice that keeping the world small like this is what they're doing when they're in their marriage together. She starts by taking a long look at her husband, and she just sees through the game they've both been playing more than she ever has before. She hears the way he's talking to people as he's trying to sell stuff to them, where he has this really obvious set of tactics he's using to just try to get something from people. It's a bit cringe from her perspective. More than that, though, she looks at him and she sees how he just starts complaining the second things get immediately outside of his comfort zone. She starts thinking about him more as a partner. 25 years ago, they got together. He was a law student, she was a young woman, and he asked her to marry him. They agreed to be the thing for each other that was always going to be there no matter what happens. When the world gets too hot or cold or sandy, when there's these annoying nomadic people that start coming around them a bit too close, let's make an arrangement, they said, so that we never have to deal with any of this stuff alone, facing it head on. And look, she doesn't hate the guy. He has good qualities. He's generous with her, she says. When she really asks him to do something, he'll always do it. But there's things about the way they talk to each other in this marriage that show her something important about this whole arrangement they have. He'll say things like, look, don't worry. If I ever die in some kind of accident, I've made sure you're going to be financially taken care of. Don't worry. And she hears that and she's like, okay, that's great and all. But it's also, in another sense, a really fearful thing for someone to say. I mean, to say something like that is completely missing something important about what life is, isn't it? Think of the kind of person you'd have to be to hear that and to just be completely relieved, where running from the volatility of life is one of your biggest concerns every day when you think about what your partner provides to you. And look, don't get her wrong. She appreciates that her husband would do this for her. But there's a whole other way of looking at life here, where financial hardship like that, having to start over, having your back up against a wall sometimes, is just a part of what it is to be a human being. I mean, what person structures their life around being able to run from life all the time? This goes beyond just a marriage for Camus, though. I mean, imagine if any time life came your way like this, where you're about to have to face something difficult head on. Imagine if you always had someone to bail you out so you never had to experience the hardship fully. Now, you wouldn't resent the support system, of course not. But to structure your life in this way, that would be in denial of something important about what life is. And the inverse of this is a bit strange, too, if you think about it. Imagine someone who has a really bad string of luck in their life. They lose everything. And then imagine if someone's choice was to just give up on life altogether. Both of these responses would be them staying safe, in denial of something important about a lucid take of what human existence is sometimes. In other words, this would be a way to avoid exile. And when it comes to Janine and her marriage, how much of this whole arrangement that they have with each other is just to avoid this feeling of exile? There's a sense in which she's not even sure if her husband even loves her anymore. But at the same time, she wonders, sadly, does it even really matter if he does or not, given the nature of this service that they provide each other that helps them keep their world mutually small? Now, noticing this, Janine finds herself in what you could call a double state of exile. On the one hand, she doesn't feel at home even in her own marriage, and feels like she sees beyond the set of illusions she used to live in that allowed her to deny some aspect of her life. But then she also doesn't feel at home when she's not in her marriage, or when she's out in the desert of Algeria around all these people that don't play the same set of social games that she does, and so their existence becomes an affront to her and her husband. And it's this metaphysical homelessness she's in, combined with the inability to ever go back to the way she used to see things. This puts her in a place that is very uncomfortable, where it drives her to move forward in her life in a transformative way. In other words, exile here becomes a catalyst for finding a way to relate to her existence and the people around her in a more lucid way. And what she starts to get drawn to in the story, it turns out, is the desert itself, which is just beautiful work by Camus here, to have the desert be the thing that she has a love affair with. Again, the adulterous woman as a title is not referring to her cheating on her husband with another person. She cheats on the set of cold, shallow arrangements they have with each other that ground the very essence of their marriage. See, because they're walking around one day in this story, and someone recommends to them that they climb up on top of this fort and go check out the view of the desert that's all around them. It's beautiful, they say. Janine suggests they do it. Her husband's like, why? Come on. Why? Janine says, please, can we go? He says, okay, fine, let's just go for a minute. So she gets up on top of this fort, looks out at the expanse of the desert, shooting out in all directions. And in this moment, she starts to just feel overwhelmed by how connected to this place she feels. As she looks out, she can't help but think that this desert, well, it's very empty. Some might even call it a barren landscape. But on some other level, she says, the desert is also a place that's very free. She even sees some of the nomadic people in the distance that are living their lives in the desert. They have no idea who she even is, probably never will. In other words, the desert becomes a place for her that's unrestricted by a bunch of the normal hallmarks of civilization. Things that are usually built in an attempt to try to protect people from the sun and the elements and all the problems that come with the freedom of a place like the desert. These people in the desert to her become people that are, quote, possessing nothing, but serving no one. They are the destitute and free lords of a strange kingdom, end quote. And if you've listened to the last few episodes we've done on Camus, you'll no doubt see where he's going here. This whole scene clearly represents some of the symbolism we've talked about all throughout his work. The desert represents the absurd, where on one hand, yes, it's an empty void, but on the other hand brings a person a new level of freedom. The sun represents the immanence of reality and the Mediterranean spirit outside of the typical abstractions people live in. There's also the intense weather of the desert.
Okay, so we are now at 15. So we stopped at 5 before. So you experienced 5 minutes of mid-level attention, and now you've experienced 10 minutes of mid-level attention. So we'll stop that there, but let's go back and sort of review what we've got here. So we find out that the main thing that this particular lecture seems to be focusing on is the idea of this book. So chances are, if we listen to the rest of the lecture, he would go through the 6 other stories. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But so I started writing that one down, right? Basically, we find out that it's an uncomfortable world on vacation, or a woman who's on vacation and she's very uncomfortable there. And there's these like talks of colonialism and how basically she starts to view her husband as being fearful of life's volatility and how the life's volatility is safety in order to avoid exile, right? So we see this arrow that I very clumsily drew to the idea of homelessness and the idea of exile, right? Off to the side here, you will see that I like during the note taking, I put like the short story Ray Bradbury's and The Moon Still Be Shining Bright. That's actually and I completely messed up the title of that particular short story, but that's a callback, right? So this is a comparison callback. So the husband reminds me of a character in that particular Ray Bradbury short story who basically thinks that like life is simply about like humanity is dumb anyway and like who cares, like people are gross, and if they aren't exactly like me, like Spender talks about his parents, and in that particular short story Spender basically says that like if people my parents thought if people weren't like them, they were bad people, right? So that was a memory for me. It was a callback and a comparison for me. And then I started listening more about how it's the idea of Sisyphus. So like the main thing about Sisyphus is basically that like you have to accept that the work of pushing the rock up the hill over and over again, day after day, you have to find joy in that work. So I'm familiar with this story. And so I brought that idea over here. Notice that I have a big old messy arrow that goes to the next page, and that's what your notes are going to look like sometimes. You can go back and reorganize them later, right? I have a big old arrow over here because I remember Sisyphus. And then my brain started going back to the concept of the fear that this wife might be experiencing. And I remembered an episode from The White Lotus, right? And like, Piper, no, Popper, no. And so, like, that is a personal callback for me to help me contextualize how exile is a catalyst to change, right? And so, this is you basically taking notes during a lecture and trying to maintain that mid level of focus. If you found that difficult, if it was hard for you to watch me take notes or to take notes yourself or to listen and to keep your attention, you now have information about your ability to maintain a mid-level attention, right? Did you find your brain drifting off? Did you start to go to low attention, right? Maybe you started going to high attention and you're like, you're not taking the notes fast enough. You're missing all of this information. Oh my gosh, right? And that like anxiety spiral starts to go, right? Those are examples of you being metacognitive during this practice. And that's why practicing this is important because it helps you recognize the patterns of your own attention. And considering we live in a world in which attention is the new economy, I think it's really important for us to be aware of how we budget our attention. And this is an example of you practicing your budget. This is an example of you making sure that the way that you pay attention is paying attention to the things that the system tells you are important, even if in your mind those things aren't important and they are not interesting, right? Because your brain doesn't understand important. It does, but it doesn't understand why that should dictate attention, okay? And we can yell at our brains all day, like, pay attention, pay attention. But oftentimes our brains are going to rebel from that in some way, shape, or form. So this is you practicing this skill, and it is a skill of you balancing that mid-level attention. And mid-level attention is hard. We like high levels of attention. We like the rabbit hole. We like scrolling on. That's why TikTok is great because it's a feedback loop, right? So we just get immediate feedback and we can like go down a rabbit hole and all of those things. Or if we're doing a video game, immediate feedback loop. This is you maintaining a lower level of attention that's mid-level, but not the lowest level of attention where you completely check out, right? Ultimately, our goal here is to practice that particular balance. And I encourage you to do this. You can do it with all sorts of things. You can do it with YouTube videos. When you first start out, I strongly suggest you do it with YouTube videos. And one of the best things that you can do is turn on a YouTube video and have like a sheet of paper in front of you. And especially if it's a YouTube video that's an informational YouTube video with visuals in it, start doing that, right? So start taking the notes and you're just listening. Try not to look too much at the screen. Instead, try simply to just take notes as you're listening. And as you're listening and you're taking notes, stop the video when you get confused. When you start to like, okay, I missed that, and you want to go back and do it, practice that. Practice like how long does it take for me if I miss something, right? Where are my auditory processing skills? Where are my auditory processing abilities? Because sometimes we have an auditory processing disorder and we need to be aware of that. And we may not be aware of that. We may just think that we're a bad student when in fact we have a delayed processing because auditorily speaking, we don't hear the same way that other people do. So having an auditory processing delay, practicing this on your own means that you're not doing it in school where grades might be involved, because that leaves a whole other level of tension and like your amygdala response and cortisol and all of that stuff, right? So this is complicated when it comes to like trying to figure out what's going on, but these are some ways for you to practice this before you actually get into class so you can be aware, you know what? When I start to drift off, I have a tendency to do insert thing here. And when I feel myself starting to do that, that's when I need to go back to my paper, raise my hand and ask a question, write a note to myself, like, review page 9 or whatever it is that I'm on. Bring yourself back in and use that self-regulating behavior, like use those self-regulating strategies. Okay, no more mid-level attention.